The pull, the nothing, the spark, and the space between. Written by Jamie Micah Howard. Narrated by Jamie Micah Howard. For the imperfect prophets, those finding their way with purpose they may not yet have language for. Chapter 1. The Nothing. I didn't lose my faith all at once. It eroded, like something left out in the weather too long, still standing but no longer solid enough to trust. I watched belief turn into performance, kindness become conditional, certainty replace curiosity. The loudest voices were rarely the deepest. So I left, not in anger, not in rebellion. I left because I could no longer pretend. What surprised me wasn't the absence of God, it was the absence of everything else. Without the noise, there was space. Nothing rushed in, no new answers, no clarity, no relief. Just quiet so complete it felt like gravity had stopped working. I thought freedom would feel lighter. It felt hollow. I didn't call it despair. I didn't call it darkness. I called it honesty. There were no prayers, only observations. People spoke for God easily, explained suffering confidently, labeled one another saved or lost, and little of it changed them. I wanted no part of belief that required blindness. So I stood in the nothing, and I stayed. Chapter 2. The Pull. It didn't arrive as a thought, no sentence, no conclusion, only a sensation. At first I thought it was emotion, a swell in the chest, pressure behind the eyes, but emotion has a story. This had none. My body knew something my mind did not. Knees weakened, breath caught, tears came without permission. Not grief, not joy, something older. I wasn't thinking about God, no prayers formed, nothing searched, yet something found me. The pull was quiet, patient, like gravity shifting upside down. I tried to ignore it, called it stress, hormones, fatigue. The body doesn't lie like the mind does. Again and again it brought me low, not in shame, but in simple recognition. It wasn't belief returning, it was alignment, and it was bigger than me. Chapter 3. The Speck. I didn't trust it at first. Anything gentle after loss feels like a trick, so I watched. It was smaller than a belief, smaller than a thought, a pause, a hesitation, a speck. So small it would have vanished if I hadn't already lost everything else. It asked one question: what if this isn't meaningless? That was enough, not to rebuild the world, but to allow the possibility. Belief doesn't begin as conviction, it begins as allowance. The speck held. Chapter 4. Recognition. I began to notice it in others before I trusted it in myself. Not in their words, in their eyes. A clarity that had nothing to do with certainty. A softness that hadn't been there before. These weren't religious people. Most carried the same doubts I did. Some had walked away sooner, harder. What unsettled me was this. I had been drawn to them long before any of us spoke this language, before there was anything to agree on. The connection existed first. Recognition came later, not as influence, not as persuasion, but as confirmation. No sermons, no slogans, no new vocabulary. Yet when we spoke, something passed between us that needed no explanation. It was recognition, a shared pause, a stillness that felt mutual. Conversations slowed. Silence became comfortable. We didn't talk about God. We talked about truth, about honesty, about how pretending had worn us out, about how something felt different now. Not better, not easier, just truer. No agreement was required, only openness. I noticed how they listened, how they didn't rush to fix or convince, how they let questions stay unanswered. Their lives weren't suddenly perfect. If anything, they were more openly unfinished. But they were changing, not upward, inward. And none of us arrived here by being led. We arrived separately and discovered we were already together. I realized then something that unsettled me. Awakening doesn't gather people by belief. It gathers them by readiness. Something was happening, quietly, not in crowds, not in public, but unmistakably. A current beneath ordinary days, pulling those who had lost their taste for certainty, not toward answers, toward alignment. Each of us arriving from within. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Chapter 5. The Imperfect Prophets. They didn't look like messengers. That was the first clue. No polish, no robes, no rehearsed certainty. Most carried visible cracks, histories they didn't hide, failures they didn't apologize for. Some had lived lives the old rules would never have allowed. Some still did. Yet something in them had shifted, not into righteousness, into honesty. They spoke carefully now, not from fear, but because words carry weight. They didn't claim to know the truth. They lived as if truth mattered. These were people broken open, not cleaned up. People who had stopped defending and started listening. They didn't recruit. They didn't persuade. They didn't correct. They simply were. In their presence, pretense dissolved. No effort required. I realized then why they felt dangerous to institutions and familiar to the soul. They had nothing to protect. No image, no authority, no certainty. Only alignment. If prophets once stood at the edges of cities, these stood at the edges of belief. Not calling people back to religion, calling them back to themselves. Their lives didn't argue for God. They made room for Him. That unsettled me more than certainty ever had. Because if awakening came through the imperfect, then it wasn't something you earned. It was something you allowed. It simply surfaced, like something remembered, not learned. The name carried no doctrine, only familiarity. Not the version handed to me before, not fenced by rules or fear. This was quieter, older. It felt less like being told and more like realizing I had always known it. Christ. Not as an answer, not as a boundary, as presence. I noticed how differently it landed now. No resistance, no recoil. Just deep, internal stillness, the kind that comes when something fits without force. I didn't rush to claim it. I didn't announce anything. I let it sit where it landed. I understood then why the imperfect had found him first. They weren't guarding identities. They weren't defending beliefs. They were empty enough to recognize him when he arrived without credentials. Christ didn't ask me to return to certainty. He asked me to remain honest. He didn't demand belief. He invited alignment. And I saw, for the first time, how much damage had been done by confusing his name with conclusions. This wasn't conversion. It was remembrance. Something ancient stirring beneath the noise, unchanged by institutions, unoffended by questions, undeterred by doubt. Once the name returned this way, without force, without fear, I understood why the pull had brought me to my knees. Some truths don't arrive to be believed. They arrive to be recognized. Chapter 7. The Overwhelm. The tears didn't come from sadness. That was the strangest part. Nothing to grieve, nothing to relive, nothing to lose. Yet the body responded as if a dam had broken. The sensation came suddenly, a surge rising from beneath thought, filling the chest faster than breath could follow. I had to stop. I had to sit. Not from weakness, from something moving through me that asked no permission. Tears arrived without images, without stories, without memory. They weren't asking to be understood. They were asking to be allowed. It felt like standing inside a wave, gentle and enormous at once. Too big to resist, too precise to ignore. I understood then why words fail here. Emotion has a cause. This had none I could name. It was recognition itself carrying weight. The body, finally aligned, releasing years of bracing. I wasn't overwhelmed by feeling. I was overwhelmed by truth without resistance. For the first time, I didn't try to stop it. I let it pass through, tears and all. like something returning home. Chapter 8. Becoming. Nothing about my life changed all at once. That's important. No announcement, no dramatic line drawn between before and after. But something fundamental had shifted. I noticed it in small ways first. Listening without planning my reply. No longer needing to explain myself. Silence no longer felt like absence, it felt like companionship. I wasn't trying to be better. That urge had fallen away. Instead, I was becoming more true, often in ways that were ordinary. I said no more easily. I rested without apology. I walked away from conversations that fed on certainty and fear. Not from superiority, from alignment. Truth began to feel less like something to defend and more like something to stand inside. I stopped borrowing words that didn't fit, stopped pretending clarity where mystery still lived. And strangely, life became simpler. Not easier, simpler. I understood then that awakening doesn't lift you above others. It returns you to yourself. There was humility in that. And relief. I no longer needed anyone to agree with what was real. Because what was real no longer required agreement. Chapter 9. Living awake in a sleeping world. The world didn't change. That was another surprise. People still argued with the same certainty, still defended positions as if being right kept them safe, still mistook volume for truth. But I moved through it differently. I stopped trying to wake anyone. That urge had faded. I saw that awakening isn't spread by force. It's recognized only when someone is already listening. I noticed how often people spoke past each other, how quickly fear dressed itself as conviction. Instead of anger, I felt distance. Not separation, perspective. I could see how exhaustion fueled certainty, how pain demanded answers, how control wore the mask of faith. And I understood, quietly, that sleep is not a failure. It's a stage. So I listened more than I spoke. I let conversations end unfinished. I allowed others to hold beliefs that no longer fit inside me. Not because I was above them, because I was no longer required to wrestle. Awakening didn't make me louder. It made me gentler and more grounded. I learned to trust that truth doesn't need defense. It carries itself. The pull continues. The pull never left. It doesn't come and go. It deepens. It shows up now as discernment, as stillness that knows when to speak and when to stay silent, as a quiet refusal to return to pretense. I no longer mistake certainty for faith, obedience for truth, noise for conviction. What I've found is simpler and harder than answers. Alignment, a way of living that listens before it speaks, that kneels without being broken, that allows mystery to remain alive. The Great Awakening is not an event. It is not a movement. It is not something to point to or package. It is happening quietly, in people who have lost their appetite for illusion, in those who walked away from easy answers and found something truer waiting in the silence. I am watching it happen, not everywhere, not loudly, but among people I was drawn to long before any of us had language for it. Remember the nothing? The space where everything else fell away? That space is still here. It never left. It was never empty. It was only waiting. If you feel the pull, you don't need to name it. You don't need permission. You don't need to arrive anywhere. Just stop resisting. What's real will meet you there. And it will keep moving, through you, with you, as you, forever.